Hi, I'm Fraser. I'm a vehicle artist at Rivet Games, and today I'm going to be showing you a bit of what we've been working on recently. So, in advance of the new Surselva Route that we're launching soon, while the rest of the studio is busy working on that, we have been pushing ahead onto something slightly further down the line that we've been working on. These are the RHB EW4 carriages that we've been working on. They come in two variations. There's a first class and a second class, which have just finished completion for the exterior models, and I'll be showing you a little bit about them. So this is the completed first class exterior. The second class is very similar, but it does have some substantial differences that made modelling these slightly different from how we would do, a similar model that doesn't have these differences. So what I'll do is I'll show you the various stages we go through when we're approaching something like these. So when we start off a passenger carriage, it's very important for us to get certain dimensions correct. So to start off, we will make a scene like this that's very basic, that has measurements for us that we can come back to check that we're always working correctly. So something that's the kind of first place we'll start off with is the overall length of the carriage, so the buffer to buffer length. We know from resources we have available to us that this one is at its maximum length 18.5 meters. So we come in and we'll make ourselves a box that matches these dimensions. Now it's very important as well that the wheels are in the correct position for these and that the bogies are placed. So we have other distances that we have to come in and make sure we get correct as well. So one of these that we'll check is the distance from the middle of the front wheel to the middle of the back wheel. In this case, that dimension is 14.63 meters. So we have to make sure that the center of this box lines up with the center of the buffer to buffer length so that everything is placed where it needs to be further down the line. This is a really important step because if you get this wrong at the beginning, these errors are going to carry right the way through to the final product. So we make sure that we go through multiple kind of checks at this stage so that everything's where it needs to be as we progress further into the project. So one of the first things we'll do when we're approaching a set of passenger carriages like this is we'll figure out if they're both using the same type of bogies. In this case we were fortunate that they were, so what we can do is we can model the one set here that can be used all across the same carriages for both. A set of bogies like this is made up of a number of complicated pieces which we do need to strip back for performance reasons in the game. When you have something mechanical like this, it's made up of a lot of different complicated pieces. When multiple sets of this are being used in game and kind of rendered and reproduced all at once, it can have quite a performance hit. So looking at the references and the resources we had available, we have to make a judgment call of what is the silhouette of this bogie like in terms of what are the important parts that you can see, what would you pick out of it straight away. So we have to kind of pick these shapes and simplify them where needed and make sure that what we've made is still the bulk of the model, even if there are certain pieces that aren't being seen on it. So when we take the wireframe out here, it's important that we have the main forms in place, and that while there might be a wire missing or a small detail that when you zoom in really close to an image you might see, from the distance that the model is going to be viewed at, this is the type of detail we're looking to get from it. So when we're making the main body for a set of coaches like this, it's important that we're able to reuse as much of the geometry as possible between the first class and the second class. So we look at the main form, the main kind of shape that we're trying to achieve, and we look at how much of this can be used across both. So the main shell kind of shares its shape between the two of them. There are slight differences and dimensions that change between the two, but first of all we'll come and we'll settle in a form like this where we've got the profile that we're looking for, and as much of this is in place where it needs to be for us to progress further down the development for it. Usually we'll only model more or less a quarter of the carriage as we need it. So a section like this is all we would usually model, and then we would mirror that over to the other side, and then we would come in and mirror that over again. This saves a lot of time so that we're not remodeling things where it doesn't need done, and as well as when we're just working quickly and we want to see the general shape that we're going for, we can come in and just quickly mirror this even if it isn't the exact shape we need, and we can get a feel for the overall size and dimensions and see, what, this is fairly close to what the end product will look like, but it's still quite early on in development. You can see there's a lot of geometry at the edges here that's not actually doing much, that will condense down as we're kind of pulling this down to the final form factor. So as we iterate on the model and we start refining certain areas of it and adding in more details, things like these vents or the end details for the train, it really starts to take shape more, and we can see everything where it needs to be. And if we feel like something's not matching up to the reference images we have, or if we just don't feel the sizes are correct for things like doors, or if we think something has to be slightly taller, this is where we start to kind of pick those details out more, because more of the model is there and we can see it together and know that it's actually, where it needs to be. This is another stage as well where, when we have been mirroring geometry over on earlier versions of the model, we'll come in and pick out the differences that actually need to be changed. So for example, on this the first class coach here, there's a window for the toilet on the right hand side that obviously we don't have on the left. So usually what we would do is we would build the model with this window in place, then mirror it over, delete out that geometry, and then just cover that up with a plane in place here, so that what we don't have to do is start cutting in this window later down the line. It would make more sense to model it first so that the geometry is where we need it to be, and then later on we can delete what we don't need and just cover up that hole. This is the same for parts of the undercarriage, where the undercarriage is an area that can often be overlooked, but it's important to get right. So it's not the same on both sides, there's slight differences to where things are placed, and we need to make sure that these are, it's the correct model for the right place. So we set up reference palettes, so we know what the right hand side of the train has to look like, we know what the left hand side has to look like in profile, and it's important that we get these things right with the smaller details. So when the modelling for the bogies and the main carriage has been completed for the first class, we then look to start UV mapping and getting it ready for texturing and baking. So this is the model more or less in its completed form. Usually once we start texturing, we can then pick out smaller details that you can only really see once the model has, the correct livery applied to it. So there could be smaller changes that need done further down the line, but for now, this model is in a great place to start UV mapping it. So for the EW4 carriages, we decided to break it down into two different texture sets, which was the main body and all of the accompanying geometry that it has, and then the bogies will be done in a separate smaller texture. So this is the completed UVW map for the first class carriage. This will be reused for the second class. We decided to reuse as much as possible, and the second class carriage is actually built out of the first one using more or less modular pieces, which allowed us to just reuse the same textures. Usually when packing a UVW map, it's important to make as much use of the space available as possible. However, on something like this where we know that there is the potential for changes to be made, once everything is more or less packed away, you are left with gaps in your map sometimes, which it can be quite useful to have. So if we do have to approach any changes, we have space to work with here. It can be a pain if you pack a UV map using as much of the space as possible and there's nothing you can change, and then you have to then start cutting corners and trying to find places where you can squeeze in extra geometry onto this map. So once the UV mapping is completed, we take this layout here along with the model into one of our texturing programs. So there are a couple of differences on the livery between the first class and second class coaches that we have to consider while we're still at the UV mapping stage. So on the first class coach, there is a yellow stripe and a white stripe running the length of it, the yellow stripe designating that this is a first class carriage. As we were looking to share textures, we had to remember that this yellow stripe does not exist on the first class. One way that we can do this is on the UV mapping on the side of the train. So these are the faces that make up the side that would have the yellow and the white stripe on it. We break off sections of the geometry so that this side needs to be yellow for the first class, but it has to be red for the second class. We make duplicates of them so that one can be textured red and one can be textured yellow. then once the texture is completed, we can move this geometry where it needs to be on the UV map to make sure that the first class gets a yellow stripe and the second class does not. And it just has the regular red livery that the rest of the carriage uses. So inside of Substance Painter, this is the model as we start off our texturing. The checkerboard pattern on here tells us that there's no textures being applied, but the checkerboard also gives us a reference for how well the UVW mapping has worked. So a checkerboard like this, you're looking for every square to be undistorted. You're looking for each square to be uniform and make sure that there's no differences between them. In areas where we have scaled up the map to get more resolution, you will see a difference in the sizes for the checkerboard, but as long as none of the squares are distorted or there's a warping in the layout for them, then that's fine. It will look like there are some areas with warping or mismatches, but it's usually down to the fact that the surface area it's covering is smaller, so it makes it look like there's an issue with mapping when it's actually just using a smaller surface area. So we'll start off mapping by designating the areas that have different colours. So this is a really quick and easy stage where we can come in and apply the correct palette to where it needs. So on a train like this where the livery is quite simple, you can come in and really you can already see that the train's starting to take shape. Also here you can get an idea of how beneficial it is to break off the geometry for putting areas like this yellow stripe in. So on the one side, we mapped this top section to be red on the UVW map so we can see how the second class carriage would look. And then on the other side, we put in the yellow stripe that is needed. So after texturing is completed, what we'll do is we'll go back into the UVW map for the model, and for the first class carriage, I'll detach this area here and I'll move it over to match this one so that it's getting the yellow stripe that it needs. Once we've blocked in colour like this, we start to refine the textures with kind of dirt and grime and putting in the kind of wear and tear that gives it a bit more realism. Another important stage in texturing is before we bring it in here, we will do a light bake for actual lighting conditions in the model. Because we're just using diffuse textures without any kind of shininess for metal or adding in roughness values or anything like that, we'll do a bake that once we activate it in here, it simulates and replicates light for the textures. So you can see we're getting things like little highlights along the bottom here where it curves and you're starting to get bits of shadow. It makes the undercarriage darker and it starts to fade into the kind of lighting at the back of it. So this is really important because you then start to be able to see the shading on the train and know that if curves have the correct form. So once the bake has been applied inside of Substance Painter, you can see the model's really starting to take form. But what we can do here is we also start to pick out little details that we'll need to go back into the model and change. So for example, on this destination board, the way that it's been mapped has given us this small gap where the white stripe should be running along the textures on it. Because of the way it's been mapped, this isn't something we can actually fix inside a Substance Painter. This is something we'll go back into the model and shift the geometry slightly so that stripe has been leveled out for the entire length of the train. So at this stage, we'll start moving forward with adding dirt and grime to the model, making it a bit more lived in and giving it the kind of dirt and things that would appear on it after it's been running on a railway for some time. So we start to add on just general dirt that darkens places like the underside. We don't want to cover a carriage like this in kind of wear and tear, so it usually is quite subtle where you're only just starting to pick out little areas here where the dirt starts to take place, usually where it would, where corners and bits of geometry meet. That's usually where you'll find things like dirt and grime gathering up. As we start to add on more, you can see it's taking its place at the base of the door, along the edges and the kind of main body of it. We start darkening places like the corners, again where things like dirt will gather in. We start to add kind of rain marks to the roof where the roof's one of the most exposed parts, obviously you're going to get little bits of discoloration and kind of moisture and watermarks where the rain has been running down the length of it. An area like the buffer here where the carriages come into contact and there's a lot of movement going on at this stage where things are being disconnected and connected up, you will get more dirt and things gathering up. So we'll come in and we'll start painting more stuff by hand and refining areas like this and trying to make it a bit more non-uniform in terms of where it's been placed. So an area like the bottom here, once we do start to get more kind of dirt where it needs to be, it can make the top look just a bit too clean. It looks, you know, a bit too perfect. So we will start adding in more layers that we can go through here. So you will get where different pieces attach on. That's where dirt really kind of starts to gather up around the edges, and then we'll add just a bit more on top of it. So a lot of this we hand paint on, because a lot of the auto-generated stuff can just be a bit too it can end up looking a bit too fake, where we'll just try and spread out a little bit more, because these things do get cleaned, but there are areas that get missed, and you know, the cleaning's usually never perfect. So we'll come in and we'll try and kind of replicate a bit of that human error and just a bit of that randomness that can happen when these things are exposed. So like I said, the buffer is an area that comes into contact with the other carriages, you know, every single day, and they do take a little bit of a beating. So the buffer just now is in a bit of a kind of generic state. We've added, you know, a little bit of dirt over it. It's been discoloured slightly, but it's important for us to come in and give it a more photorealistic look, where we chip off the paint and we crack it, and there's edge wear to make it look like that. You know, these things do take a little bit of a beating. So if we work our way through the layers, we can see that we have edge damage that we kind of paint on there. This is just, you know, where the paint and the iron starts to chip away from it. Then we take a bit of kind of scaling dark damage, where everything, you know, like when the paint starts to get chipped away, these layers underneath then start to kind of degrade, and they start to take more of a beating from the elements. Then we have kind of general cracks along where the paintwork and everything's starting to kind of fade away. And as we work through the layers, you can just see that there's a bit more goes into these to try and make them look a bit more realistic. This is an area that, you know, it's quite important for us to get right, because if this is sitting at the end of a line of carriages, you know, you want to make sure that the detail that's put in here is kind of worthy of the rest of the model. Because the carriages can be seen in a number of different seasons, and you know, they're used throughout the year, we have to kind of prepare for that by doing winter textures for them. So the winter textures, we're usually just trying to give the hint that, you know, these things are being outside, they've been snowed on, and that's replicated on the tops of them. So the roof is usually where the majority of this work is done, but other areas where you have little lips or small areas that are overhanging, you will start to see snow on surfaces like this, as well as near the buffer, you know, where these things are running up against the snow banks, you will see it start to build up at the sides, and along here as well. This is an area that we'll come in and do, you know, a bit more hand painting to make sure this doesn't look too auto-generated. So we'll have a paint layer where, using a graphics tablet, we can come in and start to delete and mask out edges that we don't need. So if I grab a brush, something like this. So for areas like the snow, we'll come in and we'll try and kind of hand paint as much of this detail as possible. We want to take away some of the crisper edges and just make it look not very kind of auto-generated or like it's been placed on purpose. This is kind of where the devil's in the details, and you want to make sure that there's not one area that's letting down the rest of what otherwise could be a nice model with a nice set of textures. So yeah, stuff like this, where the model's still being finalised, we'll take out parts here, because this is where the small details can really kind of let down all the rest of the work that you'll put into it. So we'll come in and we'll just get rid of details like this that we don't want. This is where the graphics tablet or, you know, similar tools can really make the difference for you. Because of the variable pressure that the tablet picks up, you can really take out finer details, and you can just get a bit more control over what it is you're trying to achieve than you can with like a regular mouse. So the majority of the exterior textures, you know, once we reach this stage and we've got our winter textures, that's the main body more or less at a stage where we'll take it in game and make sure we're checking everything. During or throughout texturing, we will take it into the game engine and make sure everything's looking how it needs to be as well. But it's once we get to this stage, it's important that we go in and really give things a thorough look to pick out any errors that may have ended up here. So the bogies are very similar to how we go about texturing the majority of the carriages, but because the bogies do go through a bit more wear and tear and kind of punishment closer to the ground, we really put a bit more kind of thought and time into making sure that these look correct. So we'll start off with our kind of base layers and build up again to things like dirt and grime. Then if we want to separate areas like the wheels, we'll do separate folders and layers for that. Then we start putting details on like the springs and the texture that needs to be on the inside of the wheels, because they're kind of rolling along the rails. They look different to how the rest of it will. And on top of that, we then start adding in little details that we want to paint in by hand. And then on top of all that, the same as the main carriage, our bake goes on top. It can look quite strange without the main carriage on top, why so much of this is dark, but in the context of when you have this on top, lighting conditions and shadows kind of dictate that a lot of this isn't actually viewable to the naked eye usually. So when the bake is removed from the bogie textures, you can see that there is a lot more going on here that the shadows kind of start to hide. Quite often I will come in and I'll texture it without the bake on top of it, because we want to see the kind of majority of where the wear and tear is kind of taking place on it. Because the bake hides that, doesn't mean that we shouldn't be texturing it on there, because we might come back in and rebake at some point, which means that these textures they might become more viewable, and we don't want to have to come in and then start adding textures in further down the line just because we cut a corner in the first place. So when we're texturing something like this, I will make sure that areas that you could potentially see later down the line have at least some texture or textured to the same degree. Currently I'm working on the interior for the EW4 carriages. It's kind of at the kind of 75% stage where the model is complete. We're working with texturing and putting things where they need to be. So one thing that's quite important for the interior is using tileable textures where we can, so that we're not giving something like the carpet, which takes up a massive amount of room. It needs quite a high resolution texture for the carpet pattern, but for something this big, it's difficult to do that using conventional texturing. So what we'll do is we'll tile something like a smaller, higher resolution carpet. Using our references that we have available, we take a very large number of photographs. So we'll come in and we'll select one of the photographs we've taken, something like this, or one of the other ones that has a high resolution version of the carpet. Due to lighting conditions, when these pictures are taken, you have to remember that the carpet doesn't actually look as bright as this because of the fluorescent lighting inside of it. It's actually quite dark. It's closer to this kind of colour when it's unlit. So what we'll do is we'll take an image like this and we'll come into Photoshop and we'll make ourselves a tileable texture from it. So we'll start off with a section of the carpet like this that's relatively straight on with kind of minimum warping on it. Then we'll replace edges along the top and the bottom and the left and the right, so that when they're placed alongside each other, the texture tiles. So we'll add in edges like these, then we'll darken it down to a level where we need it. So this texture is, a quarter the size of, the entire texture for the exterior, but because it covers such a large surface area, we need to make sure that this is kind of high quality. So this is then tiled across the entirety of the floor for our first class carriage. The second class carriage is very similar, using a different texture, so we'll do the exact same process. We'll come in, find a high enough resolution image, and we'll create a tileable texture out of that. So after texturing is more or less completed, or we feel the model's in a place where we can move forward with it, then we end up back here where the first class is more or less completed. There are wee details here that you might pick out and think that isn't look right. The destination boards and the running numbers for the train are dictated by script in the engine, so we put placeholder textures in the model here so that we have something to look at just when we're working in our 3D software. In practice, what we'll do is once the first class meets a different stage in the production pipeline, we'll take that and we'll make a version of the B out of it. But once the first class is in this state, we can take the pieces it's made of and make ourselves a second class carriage out of it. So it looks very similar, but there are some key differences between the first class and the second class. For example, the first class carriage is 18.5 meters long, whereas the second class carriage is 16.45 meters long. The differences here being that the windows aren't as spaced out and the windows aren't as long. So the model is made out of modular sections like this, where we would take the first class and we would take out the sections we don't need, so we can reuse them to make the sections of the B. So this here is just a piece of the first class carriage where we've moved the windows closer in together, and we just use multiple versions of it to recreate the exterior for the second class as well. The yellow stripe that we textured on the first class is taken out as well, and we just move this geometry into place so that we get the same red livery as the rest of it. So you can see it's very similar. There's a lot of the same design used for the two of them, but the key difference, like the overall length, we have to make sure we get that right and we don't just make them the same size because it's easier for ourselves. So a section of the undercarriage for the second class isn't actually present on the first class. So this box here, we had to make sure that we modeled this with the rest of the first class and just textured it and basically made sure it was included in the pipeline, so that when we came to make the second class coach, we could just put this where it needs to be. Because if we'd forgotten about this and we had modelled the first class, UV mapped it and textured it and not left space for something like this, we're then left with an issue of how do we get this into game? Do we now need to start making new textures? And it would basically throw a spanner into the works at a stage where we really wouldn't want it. So we just model this piece along with the rest of the first class carriage, and when we reach this stage we'll just slide it into place, and it really makes the life a lot easier. So once we've rebuilt the second class out of the first class carriage, what we'll do is we'll replace the decals that have been used in the first class. So the decals are a separate texture that we generate all of the different labels and writing and any kind of design that may be needed on the train that we need to get in high resolution. Details like this are really difficult, if not impossible, to get on the main texture sheet for something like a carriage. So we'll come in and we'll just condense it all into as small a space as we can get it, and then these will be cut out and floated alongside the main geometry inside of our 3D software. So we'll bring that decal texture into our software and we'll just cut out the pieces that we need and put them into place. It can look quite strange in here that they all have a red background. This is removed with textures in the game by the time that it's actually released. This is just for the purposes of placing it in the model, that they need to have some form of background on them. You may have noticed on the decal sheet as well that we do have 3 different labels and names and branding that are left along the side of the train. This is because of the location that these carriages are used. There's Italian, German and Romanish languages along the side of them. So the first class carriage has German and I believe Romanish along the sides of it, and the second class carriage has Italian and German, or it has it basically the first and second class don't have the same branding along the sides of them. So once the decals for the first class and second class are all set up and ready to go, the exteriors are more or less complete, and we give them a final check inside of the game engine. We set up a simple scene with a piece of track where we can connect these up and just check that everything is where it needs to be for them. The interiors for these are modelled separately and textured separately, so just now when there's nothing inside them, we're not worried about that. We're just making sure that it is where it needs to be. during modelling for the interiors, we are constantly checking to make sure it matches the exterior. For the purposes of the exterior, we're quite happy to check it in here and call it finished without the interior, as that'll be added later down the line. Details for the decals are not necessarily limited to things like logos or kind of small detailed labels. There are sometimes where we will come in and add in textures with decals, like these kind of diamond and triangular livery signs on the side of them. It can be quite difficult to do these again well with textures because of the amount of space something this small takes up. So on our decal sheet, we'll just put these in and then again cut it out and paste it into where it needs to be on the model. So the decals are just kind of floating alongside the rest of the model, and by the time you see them in game, they are cut out and kind of it's almost impossible to tell where these are connecting onto the side of the model. Animations for a carriage like this can be done, at this stage when everything is textured, but usually we like to tackle them once modelling has definitely been completed and we're happy with where everything is. So animations for carriages like this are quite simple. There is usually just doors and windows. So we can see here along the animation timeline that everything is kind of where it needs to be. The window animations, although they're all animated at once, they are controlled via scripting inside the game, and they don't all open at one spot. They're all animated at one spot. The animations are exported separately, so that the game engine can then control which animation it starts. So when we're animating something like the doors, depending on the way the handle mechanism works, sometimes the door will just kind of open on its own and the handle won't move, but it is quite nice when we get to add in a small detail, like as the door comes out the way, you can see the handle activates slightly as well. So that's just kind of a nice detail that we get to add in depending on the design. When working with the interior, it's slightly different from the exterior, where the images taken inside can look drastically different from what you might end up modelling, and this is mostly a perspective issue. So when we're looking at reference images like this, and it's important to remember that camera distortion causes sizes to look different. These windows might seem taller. The person who took this image, might be standing higher up than, the way we're looking at it in here. So we have to remember things like that when we're modelling, so that we're not second guessing ourselves and, changing things when they may not necessarily need changed. As well as the kind of extensive photo reference we have, and when we do send someone out to do a vehicle survey, it's really good when we get them to do walkthroughs of carriages such as this one. It allows us to, double count things like how many chairs there are, the orientation and things of them, but it's also just a different perspective and way of seeing the different parts of the carriage, especially for areas at the ends here where we can get a better look at some areas, and it just gives us it's a better way to show areas that a photograph might not be able to show us very well. A carriage like this can seem quite simplistic in some ways in terms of we're mirroring a lot of the geometry, a lot of things are being reused, but there are areas that when you start to investigate them, it's not quite clear what's going on. A good example of this for the EW4 is the gutters that run along the entire length of the train. So an image like this one, when we zoom in this area, it can be quite difficult to tell that there is an actual gutter running along the edge of this here. The red section almost looks like it's welded straight onto the side of the entire roof, and it could be quite difficult to know what's quite happening there. We have vast kind of reference libraries that we can go through, but we may not necessarily have the image that perfectly tells us how something is attached. So it's images like this that are really good for us to see that there's definitely an edge that is part of the roof here. This is kind of riveted straight onto the side, but you do have this gutter that is protruding out the way as well as along the width of it. Then at the other end, you can just start to make out that this is actually a separate piece that is running along the entire length, and it has this edge that is meant to collect water and carry it out over the back to stop it from running onto people. So an area like this can be quite difficult to figure out unless you have high quality reference images or you're not particularly familiar with how these are actually built. So once the model is completed, you can look at it and think, oh yeah, it must be that shape, it must look this way, but figuring that out during the modelling process can be quite difficult, and making sure that you do get small details like this gutter running along the length, and the way that it attaches onto the vents of the side. This is, small details that we're trying to get right, because it's how they're actually built, and it doesn't kind of do them justice to just make it up or try and figure out a way to go 50% for it. So a set of carriages like this, first class and second class EW4, it's so important during the early stages to think about what you're going to be doing later, because things like that will trip you up, and if you don't get them right at the beginning, you're going to be going back and forwards and redoing things that you don't want to have to do. So pre-planning and knowing how you're going to tackle challenges like reusing textures, or the fact that one carriage is shorter than the other, knowing that you have a method and a kind of plan to deal with these, means that you're setting yourself up for success, and you're going to have less problems, and you're generally going to have a smoother pipeline for producing assets like these ones.